Hi, I'm Felix O'Reilly, and today on the Felix Factor, we have a special report coming from Campbell Biology Textbook, Chapter 37 on Community Biology. Leading this segment is Felix Heron from Hanover High School, so stay tuned after this commercial break. Hello, bio gurus. This is Professor Felix, and we're here to talk today about Chapter 37, and we've got a lot to talk about, so let's get going. So the first thing we're going to talk about today are biological communities and why they're important. The official definition of a community is a group of different species that interacts with each other. And it's important to study community biology to figure out the different connections that go on between species and also to preserve endangered species within communities. Within communities, there's often interspecific interactions, which means interactions between different species. Here we can see two species of turtles, the turtle Greenus smallis and the turtle otheris, and they are both competing over this aquatic vegetation that they both need to eat. That means that is called interspecific competition, because both of the species are competing over the same resource. And this results in a negative effect for both species because there is, of course, limited resources and more organisms that want to eat it than it exists. Another interspecific phenomenon is interspecific mutualism, which is when multiple species interact in a way that benefits them both. For example, this giant green sea turtle, much like the hippopotamus, has lots of excess residue on its body, along with parasites. And the ugliest, purplest fishes, likes to eat these parasites and also the excess residue, which helps the fish to gain food and support itself, and it also helps the turtle because it rids itself from parasites that could cause it to become sick and become less able to survive. So that is interspecific mutualism. Another phenomenon is interspecific predation, which you can probably guess is when one species preys on another. For example, this fish, this shark is preying on this sperm whale. It obviously benefits the shark because it gives it energy, and it does not benefit at all the sperm whale because it dies and becomes prey. So that is a plus minus for the predator. Interspecific herbivory is when an animal preys on a plant. For example, this canvasback duck is preying on this marine plant, and it benefits the duck because it gains energy, and it does not benefit the aquatic plant because it is being eaten. The last interspecific relationship we're going to examine is parasitism, where parasites come and infect a plant or animal. As you can see when you look closely at this aquatic plant life, it has little dots on it, which, believe it or not, are little fungi, which are infecting and eating this plant, and that is, of course, a plus minus in favor of the parasites because they are eating, or they are decomposing and digesting the plant, and the plant is being eaten. The definition of an ecological niche is the sum of abiotic and biotic factors in a species environment. Another mutualistic relationship is between this jungle leopard and this jungle toucan. The jungle leopard fends off lots of predators of the toucan eggs, like skunks, and in return, the toucan provides many offspring, some of which the leopard can eat. Another example of a mutualistic relationship is between coral polyps and dinoflagellates. Corals provide a source of shelter for the dinoflagellates, and in return, the dinoflagellates give lots of energy to the coral polyps via photosynthesis. Now, predation is when one species hunts and kills another, and this is so harmful to the prey species that it often comes up with adaptations to help it survive from these attacks. For example, this sea turtle here almost completely blends in with this aquatic plant life so that it cannot be seen by its predator, this purple shark. Also, it has a very hard shell, so that when the purple shark tries to bite it, it unfortunately cannot puncture through its shell and cannot kill it. Take, for example, this purple fish. Its niche involves eating this aquatic plant life. Unfortunately, that overlaps with this fish's niche as well. They both eat this aquatic plant, so their niches overlap, which causes lots of interspecific competition between the two as to who can eat this aquatic plant life. Coevolution is when different species evolve with each other, adapting after the other one does, kind of like tag. This is sort of a zany example, but at one point, let's say that this turtle, which could walk on land, as you can see, it can breathe air by its nostrils, preyed upon this chicken, which lived on the earth as well. Over millions of years, the chicken evolved so that it could swim effectively in water, thus giving it an advantage over the turtle, which could not swim. The turtle then evolved over other millions of other years so that it could continue preying on the chicken by swimming in water as well. The turtle, for example, grew camouflage so it could camouflage with the aquatic plants on the bottom of the ocean. The duck, therefore, evolved to be an efficient flyer so it could spend more time out of the water to avoid the turtle at the bottom of lakes. This is how coevolution works. Pathogens can have a big effect on community composition. In a typical terrestrial biome, we have the producers, like this plant, and they typically photosynthesize to create energy for the biome. Then we have primary consumers, like this ladybug, that eat the producers. And then we have secondary consumers, like this bluebird here, which typically eat the primary consumers and are therefore the secondary consumers. Then we have species like this leopard, which eat the secondary consumers and are therefore called the tertiary consumers. And if there were to be a species in this particular community that ate leopards, this species would then be the quaternary consumer of this community. In an aquatic biome, the producers are aquatic vegetation, or oftentimes phytoplankton, which photosynthesize sunlight into energy for the ecosystem. Primary consumers, like this piece of zooplankton, might feed on the phytoplankton, and they are the primary consumers. Then organisms that might feed on them, like this duck, are the secondary consumers, and organisms that might feed on them, like this shark, would be the tertiary consumers because they eat the secondary, and then killer whales like this would be the quaternary consumers. Oftentimes in biomes, for example, this aquatic biome, we have the producers, and then we have creatures that are sometimes primary, maybe secondary, or even tertiary consumers, and those are all different. For example, we have this turtle here, which mostly forages on aquatic plants, but sometimes it might eat smaller fish like this, and therefore it could be a secondary or primary consumer. And with interactions like this, one might often find food webs to be more informative than food chains because they show different connections between primary or secondary, or tertiary, or quaternary consumers and how they interact. Species diversity within a community can be measured in different ways. The first would be species richness, which is the number of species in a community, and also relative abundance, which is the proportional representation of a species in a community. Given that there are 4 turtle species here, all of whom have 100 organisms present, the species richness of this community is 4. There are 4 different species, and the relative abundance is 25% per species, resulting in a very or relatively diverse group of turtles. However, given that there are 100 of these turtles interspersed among 10 of these, that would mean that the species richness is still 1 and 1. So each share 50% of the species richness, but the relative abundance, there are 100 of these and only 10 of these. So this is a less diverse group of species, and therefore is much more susceptible to disease or a parasite, which might feed specifically on this kind of turtle, which would wipe out a lot of this population because it dominates so much of the turtle community. A keystone species is a species which, if removed from a community, would have catastrophic effects on the structure of the community. Long-spined sea urchins are an example of a keystone species, for they live in and around coral reefs, and if removed from their habitat, the seaweed on which they prey would become very prevalent. This happened, in fact, in 1983 when there was a disease among long-spined sea urchins, and the seaweed then became very abundant among the coral reefs and blocked sunlight from the dinoflagellates, which provide many nutrients and energy for the coral reef. This made the polyps die, but it also destroyed the community on which many other organisms lived in and around. The hairy woodpecker, as seen here, is another example of a keystone species. Hairy woodpeckers live in deciduous forests, and they forage among bugs living under tree bark. Now, if the hairy woodpecker and all other woodpeckers were to vanish suddenly, then the bugs would start infesting the trees without any predators to eat them, and they would start infesting the deciduous trees. Eventually, this would kill many of them, and that would ruin the whole a large habitat for many species that live in deciduous forests, not only the trees, which would also die, but other birds and insects and plants that use the trees as habitat and or food. When you think of disturbances, you might think, oh man, it's probably not good for a community. But in fact, when a disturbance happens within a community, it creates room for more species and more habitat for a species or a community to grow more diverse. For example, if lightning were to strike several trees in a wooded area and they were to start running, it might greatly increase the population of termites, which would add to the diversity of that place. Primary succession is when life comes from a place where there previously was none, like this glacier that's just slid off. The first step after that is lichen that appears on rocks, and then perennial grasses, after which come shade-tolerant trees and shrubs like these, and then shade-intolerant trees which grow and become a forest. Obviously not exactly like these, but you get the idea. Secondary succession is when life comes from a place where there previously was, like this abandoned cornfield. Then some perennial grasses might start to grow, and then some shade-tolerant trees, and after that, some shade-intolerant trees. And this generally takes less time than the primary succession because there previously was life and an established soil. So consider this community with the producer and the primary consumer, the zooplankton, and the secondary consumers, these turtles, and this whale. This is a perfectly functioning community with a fair amount of interspecific competition and etc. Now, what would happen if this turtle were brought in, which is much faster and reproduces very quickly? Not to mention, it only feeds on this aquatic plant. What would happen is it would quickly eat it all up, and therefore the numbers of zooplankton would go down very, very, very much because there would be no more aquatic plant life for it to feed on. So this species would be wiped out. Therefore, there would be no more zooplankton for these turtles, for this whale to feed on. And therefore, there would be no more turtles or whales for this killer whale to feed on. And so it would be all gone, including the producer, leaving only the invasive species. So this is what shows what an invasive species can do. It can really have great damage on a functioning community because when it shows up, no one else or none of the species there had adapted to it and had created defenses for um, if it for its presence, where in its old community, it's likely that this species had a lot of predators, limiting its spread, or else it would have reproduced very quickly and had the same effect as it did here, whereas it had no predators in this new ecosystem. The process of energy flow and chemical cycling in an ecosystem is very different. Energy, at least in our biosphere, comes in perpetually from the sun and provides the Earth with a constant supply of energy, which rises through the trophic levels and then mostly gets um, deposited in the form of heat. Whereas chemicals, for example, if we have a molecule of nitrogen, might get absorbed by a plant and then eaten by a bird, and then excremented, and then decomposed by a decomposer, and then brought back into the ground again, um, which then keeps cycling in such a manner, which shows that chemicals cycle throughout a community or an ecosystem, whereas energy flows from the sun through the trophic levels and out as heat. Biomass is defined as the amount or mass of living material in an ecosystem. Because there are so few photosynthetic organisms in the open ocean, there is very little primary production per unit area. However, since is so much open ocean, the amount of it contributes to a very large amount of the Earth's primary production per year. In comparison, coral reefs and similar biomes, which cover very little territory on the Earth but have very large amounts of primary production per unit area, are um, are much more efficient, but are nonetheless they contribute very little to the Earth's overall primary production. Another example of high levels of primary production are tropical rainforests, which cover a reasonably large amount of the Earth, not a ton, but they are also very efficient, like coral reefs, in primary production. Suppose in an aquatic ecosystem we have some aquatic plant life here. It may receive any amount of sunlight, but its efficiency is only about 1%. So only 1% of the sunlight it receives is actually converted to energy by this photosynthetic organism. Then we have a primary consumer like this zooplankton. It may eat some of this phytoplankton from the ocean, but then while it is going about its daily routine, breathing, moving, and all that stuff, it it only passes on about 10% of the energy it received from its producer to this turtle, which eats it, and in turn, this turtle only passes about 10% of the nutrients it received from the zooplankton to this killer whale, which eats the turtle. So that is why, uh, like tertiary or quaternary predators need so much more uh, food and energy to sustain them, and that is why there are so few of them, because many of them would require a very large amount of prey. And similarly, that is why eating meat is a luxury for humans, because when we It's also why eating meat is a luxury for humans, because when we grow corn, um, that the corn, of course, receives 1% or creates energy with 1% of the sunlight it receives. If we then feed that corn to cattle, then we are losing 10% of we are losing 90% of the energy obtained from the corn as when it goes through the cattle and then into us. Whereas if we were the primary consumers by eating the corn ourselves, we would need 90% less um, because we would be the primary consumers and therefore would not be wasting any energy or wasting as much energy passing from the corn to our digestive tract. The carbon cycle starts when photosynthetic organisms remove carbon dioxide from the air and incorporate it in their organic molecules. Then consumers consume the photosynthetic organisms and incorporate those carbon dioxide molecules in their own bodies. Then, either through respiration or through cellular respiration, they return the carbon dioxide to the air. And also, decomposers remove carbon dioxide from things they decompose and return it to the atmosphere. Phosphorus is different from carbon for two main reasons. One, it is never really a limiting factor as to where plants can live, and secondly, its abiotic reservoir is not in the atmosphere. Phosphorus mainly comes from rock. This is what really kicks off the phosphorus cycle. So when rocks are weathered, which is basically them breaking down, this adds inorganic phosphate in the form of PO4 3- into the soil. Then plants can assimilate this and make it into organic compounds, which can then be eaten by consumers. Then the phosphate is returned to the soil by decomposers or in the form of animal waste and dead animals. And some of this drains down into the sea where it might form into a new rock and will not break down and will not return to the phosphorus cycle until geological processes lift the rocks back up and expose it to more weathering where they can rejoin the phosphorus cycle. Nitrogen actually has two abiotic reservoirs, the atmosphere and the soil. There's a boatload of nitrogen in the atmosphere. In fact, almost 80% of the atmosphere is nitrogen gas, or N2. However, plants can't absorb it in this form, so they rely on nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil, without which there'd really be a limited supply of nitrogen, and it would be a huge limiting factor. Some of these bacteria live in root nodules of plants, and some of them are just free living. Now, these bacteria convert the nitrogen into ammonium, or NH4 plus, and in this state, it can be absorbed by plants and then used for them. Then, of course, the process is the consumers eat them after they die, or their excrement is decomposed by decomposers, which then return the ammonium into the soil. However, after that, nitrifying bacteria get at it, and they make it into a nitrate, or NO3-, which is even more easily absorbed by plants. After the cycle repeats itself again, this time with nitrates instead of ammonium, you get the idea. Denitrifiers get at it, and they convert it into N2 once more, and returns it to the atmosphere. Some ammonium and nitrates are also made in the atmosphere via chemical reactions involving ammonia gas and N2, and this is also a crucial source of nitrogen for some ecosystem plants. Thank you for watching The Felix Factor with me, Felix Heron, and stay tuned for next week when we do another episode about plants.